All right, let's dive into this cold case. This one's going to take us back to 1956 Los Angeles.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, poodle skirts, Elvis on the jukebox.
Mm-hmm.
A world, really on the edge of a lot of cultural shifts. It's also the year that Barbara Jean Jeepson, an 18-year-old newlywed,
Wow.
was tragically murdered in her own home.
It really highlights the changes in forensic science,
Yeah.
Back then, detectives were limited to fingerprints
Right.
and really just good old-fashioned detective work.
Yeah. So let's rewind back to that day. Barbara Jean's husband, Joe, comes home.
Mm-hmm.
He finds the front door unlocked. The radio is blaring.
Oh, my God.
And it's just a horrific scene.
A nightmare.
Yeah.
Just a total nightmare.
The murder weapon was left at the scene, a butcher knife.
Oh, my gosh.
And there were signs of a struggle. What's really chilling is that Barbara Jean was 4 months pregnant.
Oh, wow.
It just adds another layer of tragedy to this whole thing.
Of course.
Yeah.
So, naturally, the initial investigation focused on Joe.
I mean, he's the one who found the body,
Mm.
and there was a bloody military jacket matching his at the scene.
But his alibi checked out.
Okay.
He was at the airbase when the murder happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's classic, right?
Yeah.
Circumstantial evidence can be really misleading,
Sure.
especially back then.
So the case goes cold. 4 years later, another murder happens in the same neighborhood.
Oh, gosh.
This time, it's 15-year-old Marianne Pedrotta. She's found dead in a stream.
Mm,
At first, they're not sure if it's an accident, but the autopsy results come back,
right.
and it's definitely not an accident.
Stab wounds, defensive marks on her body.
Oh, wow.
This was murder.
And the fact that they were both, young women found in
Right.
the same area within a few years of each other, I mean, come on.
Yeah, you think they would connected those dots, right?
You would think so, but remember,
Yeah.
this is the early 1960s.
Right.
Investigative techniques were not nearly as sophisticated as they are today.
Right. The cases remained separate, and both of them went cold for decades.
Decades. Can you imagine?
It's hard to fathom that
Yeah.
uncertainty, not knowing who took your loved one.
Yeah,
I mean, that not knowing can be the hardest part.
I would think so.
But then in 2017,
Oh, wow.
a bombshell phone call to the LAPD
Okay.
reignited the investigation into Marianne's murder.
So this is where it starts to get really interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me about this phone call.
A woman called the police, and she said she knew who killed Marianne,
Okay.
and she was the former stepdaughter of a man named Monty Mertz,
Okay.
who kept his horse in the same stable as Marianne. A seemingly small detail.
Right.
Yeah. Turned out to be crucial.
Okay, so this phone call is a turning point,
Absolutely.
not just for Marianne's case,
Right.
but potentially for Barbara Jean's as well.
That is exactly right.
Wow.
And it's all thanks to a detail
Okay.
that was buried in Barbara Jean's old case file. Detectives found a note about Mertz being present at Barbara Jean's funeral.
That's kind of strange, right?
It is a little odd, but it gets even more unsettling
Oh, no.
when you learn that Mertz was actually Barbara Jean's stepfather
What?
for 6 years during her childhood.
Hold on. Are you saying he knew both victims?
Yes, he did.
Wow.
Not only did he know them, but he had a close personal connection to Barbara Jean.
That changes everything.
This completely changed the trajectory of the whole investigation.
Talk about a shocking twist.
Right.
So how did Detective Rachel Evans, the rookie assigned to the cold case unit, how did she handle this?
Well, she dove headfirst into those old case files.
I bet those were a mess.
Oh, yeah. Decades of reports, witness statements, dead-end leads.
What did she find that connected Mertz to the murders?
Well, one crucial piece of evidence was a 1964 polygraph test
Oh, wow.
that Mertz had taken
Okay.
in connection with a separate assault case.
Polygraphs aren't admissible in court, are they?
No, they're not.
Okay.
But the results showed that Mertz exhibited what's called guilty knowledge.
Guilty knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay, explain that a little bit.
It basically means that he responded to specific questions about the crimes
Okay.
in a way that suggested he knew details that only the killer would have known.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't enough to convict him,
Right.
but it definitely raised some red flags.
So they're finally closing in on him after all these years.
It seemed that way, however.
Oh.
Before detectives could formally question him, Mertz took a drastic and tragic step.
What happened? Did he try to run?
No, it's even more chilling than that.
Oh, God.
Mertz's wife found evidence,
Oh.
incriminating evidence,
Okay.
that linked him to the murders.
Okay.
Shortly after, he killed his wife, and then he killed himself.
Wow, that's a dark turn of events. That must have been a huge setback for the investigation.
It was devastating, but Detective Evans refused to give up.
Really?
Yeah. She was determined to find a way to definitively link him to the murders, even though he was gone.
Right. He's deceased. How could she possibly prove his involvement? I mean, this is decades before DNA technology was commonplace.
You're absolutely right. The obvious answer was DNA testing.
Yeah.
But Mertz wasn't in any database, and he had been cremated.
Oh, wow.
So Evans knew she needed to find another source of his DNA.
That must have felt like searching for a needle in a haystack.
Oh, yeah.
Where would you even begin?
With sheer determination.
When?
She spent 7 hours meticulously tracking down Mertz's relatives.
Wow.
Eventually locating his son, who was living in Utah.
7 hours. That is incredible. Talk about dedication.
Yeah.
Did his son cooperate?
He did, but there was another complication.
Okay.
Mertz's son was suffering from Alzheimer's.
Oh, wow.
This presented a unique challenge for Evans.
Yeah.
She needed to get a DNA sample,
Right.
while also being sensitive to his condition.
That must have been incredibly difficult,
Yeah.
both logistically and emotionally.
It was. Evans handled the situation with empathy and professionalism, though. Drawing on her personal experience with loss,
Okay.
she patiently explained the situation to the son and obtained the DNA sample.
Okay.
She also met with other members of Mertz's family
Okay.
and informed them about his crimes and his death.
Wow.
Can you imagine having to confront a family secret like that?
After all these years? No.
Yeah.
That's heavy stuff.
It is.
It really speaks to Evans's compassion.
Yes.
And her commitment to the truth, no matter how difficult it is.
Absolutely.
But the big question remains, did that DNA finally crack the case wide open?
Well, unfortunately, it wasn't that simple.
Oh, no.
The blood sample from the military jacket found at Barbara Jean's murder scene, it was too degraded to get a conclusive DNA match.
Another dead end. After all that effort.
It was a heartbreaking setback, but Detective Evans wasn't ready to give up just yet.
Oh, okay.
Remember, she had a mountain of circumstantial evidence pointing to Mertz.
You're right. Witness descriptions, his connection to both victims, the history of violence, it all adds up.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll explore how Evans put together this really compelling case.
Right.
Ultimately led the LAPD to officially link Mertz to Barbara Jean's murder, even with the lack of a conclusive DNA match.
Can't wait. We're back, and wow, I'm still thinking about that connection between Monty Mertz and both victims, both Barbara Jean and Marianne.
Yeah, it really shows how cases that seem totally unrelated can be connected in crazy ways.
Yeah.
And even though that DNA evidence wasn't a perfect match, Detective Evans didn't give up.
So even without that DNA link, she was so confident that she could connect Mertz to the murders.
Oh, yeah. She felt strongly that she had enough to build a really strong case against him.
What evidence did she end up focusing on?
Well, she was super thorough, and she documented everything.
Okay.
Witness descriptions from way back in the 50s and 60s that actually matched Mertz.
Oh, wow.
His presence at Barbara Jean's funeral, which we know now. And his history of violence against women.
It sounds like she was really determined to get to the bottom of this. What did the other detectives think? The ones who had doubted her at first.
Even the detectives who had been doing this for years were impressed by her work.
I bet.
One of them even said that she might be gifted at solving cold cases.
Well, cracking a case that's been cold for over 60 years, that definitely sounds like a gift to me.
Yeah.
But what about Mertz? What kind of person does something so horrific? Especially to someone they should be caring for, like a stepdaughter.
That's a question that a lot of people try to answer.
Yeah.
Psychologists, criminologists. It's clear that Mertz was a troubled guy.
Yeah.
His history of violence and how he died, all of it points to some really disturbing behavior.
It makes you wonder what was going on in his head. Did his family know? Was there any sign that he could do something like this?
It's hard to know. Sometimes people like that are really good at hiding their true selves.
Right.
They can seem charming and fool everyone around them. It's a scary thought that evil can look so normal.
And in this case, that evil stayed hidden for decades.
Yeah.
It left two families grieving and searching for answers for years. It's just unimaginable.
Yeah.
So even without that DNA match, Evans believes she had enough to present a solid case to the LAPD, right?
She did, and they actually agreed with her.
Really?
Yeah. In 2022, more than 6 decades after Barbara Jean's murder, the LAPD officially linked Mertz to the crime.
That must have been a huge win for Evans.
Oh, definitely.
But more importantly, for Barbara Jean's family and for Joe, who was suspected for so long.
It was a bittersweet victory, for sure.
Yeah.
Mertz couldn't be put on trial, but the truth was finally out there.
Did Evans reach out to Joe Jeepson's children?
Yeah, she did. She contacted them personally to tell them about the LAPD's decision.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine what that must have been like for them? After all these years, their father's name was finally cleared.
Yeah.
The real killer was identified. I'm sure it was a huge relief.
It shows that justice can take many forms. It's not always about a guilty verdict in a courtroom.
Right. Sometimes it's about the truth coming out and families finding some peace and being able to move on.
Exactly. And it really shows how dedicated Detective Evans was to this case.
Mm-hmm.
She went above and beyond to make sure the family knew the truth.
Yeah.
But even with the case closed, there's still that question.
Yeah.
Why did Mertz do it? We know he had a past, but what made him target Barbara Jean?
That's a mystery that might never be solved.
Yeah.
With Mertz gone, we may never fully understand what drove him to do this.
It's frustrating to be so close to the truth and still have these unanswered questions.
I know.
It's like a puzzle with a missing piece.
It's the nature of these cold cases. We're often left with more questions than answers.
Yeah, I guess so. But even without a motive, is there anything in the evidence that could help us understand why?
Evans believes that Mertz's history with Barbara Jean, along with his pattern of violence against women, suggests a really disturbing possibility.
Okay, this is the part that's been bothering me this whole time. What do you mean?
It's hard to know for sure, but it's possible that Mertz abused Barbara Jean when he was her stepfather.
Oh, wow.
And him being at her funeral years later, it could have been his way of showing that he still had control over her.
That's a terrible thought.
It is.
To think that Barbara Jean might have been suffering even before that day in 1956, it just makes this whole story even more tragic.
It is a reminder that domestic violence can happen in many ways, and it can have lasting effects.
Yeah, you're right. We can't ignore these bigger issues.
Right.
It's not just about solving a crime. It's about understanding why it happened and trying to prevent it in the future.
Exactly.
And that brings us to something else important. How forensic science has changed over time.
It really is amazing how much has changed, even in just the last few decades.
Yeah.
What used to be considered high-tech is practically ancient history now.
And in part 3, we'll dive into that world of forensic science and how DNA technology is helping solve these cold cases that used to seem impossible.
It's pretty exciting stuff.
We've really gone deep into the Barbara Jean Jeepson case.
Yeah, we have.
From the old school detective work in the 50s to the power of DNA technology today. It's really a story about how much forensic science has changed.
It's incredible how much things have changed, even in just the last couple of decades.
Yeah.
What used to be the latest and greatest is now practically ancient history.
It's true, but some things never change.
Like what?
Like good old-fashioned detective work.
Yeah.
Following the evidence, never giving up hope, even when a case seems impossible.
Absolutely. And those are the things that finally led to solving this case.
Right.
Detective Evans's persistence, her willingness to think differently,
Yeah.
and her dedication to finding the truth, even when it seemed hopeless, that's really remarkable.
It shows that justice can be a long and complicated process.
It really can.
Sometimes it takes decades to figure things out, and even then, it might not be what we expect.
That's true.
In this case, there was no trial, no big courtroom drama, but the truth came out.
Yeah.
And that brought some peace to the families involved.
Right, and that leads to a question for our listeners.
Okay.
What does justice really mean when the person who did it is already dead? Does officially closing the case, knowing that Mertz was responsible, bring real peace?
It's a tough question.
It is.
Or is there always that question mark hanging over everything because there wasn't a trial and a conviction?
It has to be frustrating for the families to know that Mertz will never have to answer for what he did in a court of law.
It makes you think about the limits of our justice system.
Yeah.
What happens when someone is beyond the reach of the law? Is closure even possible then?
Right. It makes you realize that justice isn't always the same for every situation.
Right.
It can mean holding someone accountable, punishing them, helping them change, or making things right.
And sometimes finding real justice means finding peace and healing in ways we didn't expect.
Exactly, and that's what makes this case so interesting. It forces us to think about what justice really means and how complicated our emotions can be when something tragic happens.
And we can't forget about the role of forensic science in all of this.
Of course not.
The fact that we can now analyze DNA from crime scenes that are decades old is incredible.
Think about all the cold cases that could be solved now.
Yeah.
Every time DNA technology gets better, it opens up new possibilities for investigations and gives hope to families who have been waiting for answers.
And Detective Evans hasn't given up on finding those answers.
Oh, yeah.
She's going to keep submitting that blood sample every 5 years,
Oh.
hoping that one day technology will be good enough to make a definite match to Mertz.
That's amazing. It really shows her dedication to this case and how much she cares about justice.
It also shows that forensic science is always changing.
Yeah.
What seems impossible today could be possible tomorrow.
That's a good point.
It's a message of hope, not just for this case, but for all those unsolved cases out there.
It shows that we should never give up on finding the truth and seeking justice, even when it feels like there are too many obstacles.
This deep dive has been a journey through time.
It has.
We've learned about the Barbara Jean Jeepson case, but we've also thought about justice, memory, and the power of hope.
We've covered a lot of ground.
It's been fascinating and thought-provoking,
It has.
full of twists and turns, and in the end, there's a little bit of hope shining through.
I agree.
But this is just the beginning.
Right.
There's so much more to learn about cold cases, forensic science, and how these unsolved crimes affect families and communities.
That's true.
Keep exploring these stories, dig deeper into the things that interest you, and never stop questioning, searching, and seeking the truth.
Sauce.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.